And we are live, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you are noticing some video issues, don't panic. Our internet is somewhat tricky out here in the wilderness. The video is buffering right now. Thank you so much for your patience as we work through these details. Eventually, the video will work out perfectly. We hope.
We do.
For those of you who are new today, you are a part of the live Ask a Ranger feature, where you can ask a real live ranger question. So, Ranger Adriana.
Yes.
Are you ready for these questions that we've gotten over the season?
I am so ready and so excited.
Awesome. We've had a really great collection of questions here today. I'm really excited about these ones. Let's start with number one.
Okay.
All right. So, question number one. Can you explain the Katmai National Park volcanic beginning and the impact that it has on the ecosystem of today?
This is such an excellent question because this does go to the heart of Katmai's beginnings as a protected land, and to set the stage for talking about the climate impacts and the impacts of the volcano itself on the local region, we should talk a little bit about the days leading up to that eruption. So for those of you who don't know, Nova Rupta erupted on June 6, 1912, and for 4, 5, 6 days leading up to that eruption, there were many clues that something was about to happen, something big. There were some pretty big earthquakes that were going on, and through oral traditions and histories that were passed down through the locals that lived here at that time, they actually had a little bit of an awareness of what was to come. They just didn't know how big or how significant it was going to be. So people who were living in the villages around this area actually evacuated. They prepared, they knew what to do. But on June 6, 1912, for about 60 hours, this eruption was going on. This was big. It sent up plumes of ash up into the air over 20 miles high. But this also led to some really amazing discoveries about this area that was pretty little known about at that time. So this set the stage too for some explorers to come in. Very much like yourself, I know that you've been traveling around and getting to see some pretty amazing parts of the park this summer. But we had somebody by the name of Robert F., funded by the National Geographic Society to explore the area, specifically what we now call the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. What he and other explorers discovered around 1915 and 16 was this incredible valley that at the time looked very different than what it does today. But what they did discover out there was an area that was covered by at least 4 cubic miles of ash and tuft. They also saw that there were at least 2 cubic miles of the stuff, it's really fun to say, called pyroclastic flow, but it's what gives that nice sandstone color to the valley floor. And with all of that, some of the significant factors of that was that it allowed geologists and scientists to come and explore something that at that point in time hadn't been up on the surface. So I'm going to take a little time out. We are going to have some interference with plane noise, but that's going to be a perfect segue for, I think, some conversations we're going to have later on noise pollution.
So folks, that was planned right there.
And I wanted to read a quote that was posted in the National Geographic magazine from 1917 that described what Griggs saw, and there's no good way to paraphrase his beautiful words for that discovery, so I'm going to read a quote from that article, and the quote goes like this. The sight that flashed into view as we surmounted the hillock was one of the most amazing visions ever beheld by mortal eye. The whole valley floor, as far as the eye could reach, was full of hundreds, no thousands, no literally tens of thousands of smokes curling up from its fissured floor. The first glance was enough to assure us that we had stumbled into another Yellowstone Park floor. But all around the valley, or all that completely obliterated the vegetation, and looking back almost 100 years after this eruption in 2004, we can see what the recovery looked like. So I hope you can hear me over the plane taking off, but we're going to look at one more up-close look of Nova Rupta. And so you can see this really amazing moonscape landscape out there. But these pictures here show some of the vegetative recovery of the area. There were photographs taken from Hallow Bay, Amalek Bay, and throughout the valley, and these help to show that in areas along the coast, farther away from the eruption site, and even as far out as Kodiak, vegetation recovery was almost 100. Scientists and geologists on a few different levels, after they realized what a lot of the content of this ash and tuft was, they compared it to finely ground glass. So not a whole lot of nutrient value in some of these areas. But there is a really great crust of, but I wanted to show you another really neat way that you can look at and understand ecological processes, especially after volcanic eruptions, and what that can do and tell us in tree rings, for example. So this is a cut that was made in 1976, and when there is climate change, especially due to volcanic eruptions, you can actually look at tree rings and you will see something that we call suppression or release. So suppression is when there's little growth, release is when there's more growth than what's expected, and there was actually some release that was happening after 1912. So here you can act rings as they get bigger or expand out just years after the eruption. Yes.
Speaking of volcanoes, float plains.
Ah.
What are the plane noise effects on birds in Brooks Camp?
So I can say that we can see the effects of plane noises on human noises, even what we do here at the park, operation-wise, on not only birds, but on all wildlife and all life here at Brooks Camp, including us bipeds. So what's interesting is there is a term that's used to describe noise effects, negative effects on the environment, and that's called noise pollution. Have you heard of this?
I have heard of that in the past.
Yes. So what do you know about noise pollution?
I know we might be experiencing it
Yeah.
in just a little while. We may be encountering some noise pollution, folks. We also timed that one just so to happen. Noise pollution could be defined as some noise that impacts the experience around us. Is that okay as an answer?
Oh, that is perfect.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
So if you think about it in terms of like your visual environment, acoustical environments that are impacted by noise, works similarly to how smog impacts a visual environment. So noise kind of infiltrates around you and inhibits your ability to kind of go beyond your listening horizon. So animals, birds, especially for this conversation here, use sounds to communicate, to navigate, to avoid predators, also to find a mate, and if they have this, our ability to communicate with each other. But masking covers up the ability for wildlife to communicate. So beyond some of those topics we just talked about, you know, if a male is trying to court a female, or a young bird is trying to beg, making begging calls for their parents for food, these are very significant to the survivability of these animals, and noise pollution can negatively impact that. The National Park Service considers acoustical environments just as important a resource as anything else. So if you look at the Organic Act of 1960, Natural Sounds in Dark Skies Division, they are tasked with going around to our different parks and recording soundscapes, and so far they've recorded over 70 different soundscapes throughout the country. What's really great about doing the soundscape study, when you look at the ecological impacts of this, the instruments are really minimal, so there's very little human impact, as we can leave instruments out in the field for weeks at a time collecting data with little to no human presence. And then when we pick up the equipment, there's really not much of a footprint left behind there either. But this allows parks to record, to better take care of our parks. And something here that we do deal with, as we know, primary transportation to Katmai is through boat and plane. This is something that the park is taking seriously and has started conducting an acoustic monitoring project that started in 2015, will end in 2017. And so with that data, we'll be able to inform our backcountry management plan to be able to better take care of the resources out here. So that's an excellent question. I hope that people who are watching will be more curious about acoustic ecology or soundscape studies and check out the National Park Service's Natural Sounds and Dark Skies Division to learn a little bit more about what's going on in our parks and what you can do to fight noise pollution too. Absolutely.
There's some fantastic resources out there. So, this question, plot twist, is about bears.
Ooh!
Yeah! Okay. So, why are there so few bears at this year? I only see 1 or 2 no matter when I watch the cam. Are the numbers declining?
So this is another really great question. So referring to the cams, if we were to broaden that out, we could go deep into population change and dynamics, but referring to the cams, it's easy to get a little misinterpretation from what we do see on our screens. Sometimes those cameras are zoomed into one section of the river, and so we don't get the full perspective and see all of the bears at one time. We may just see a few. But there were a couple of things that were different about this year that may have caused there to actually be some different numbers of bears. Water levels were pretty high last year, making it maybe more difficult to fish in lower sections of the lower river, and so you maybe saw more bears up at the falls. But this year, with our lake level low and our lower river area level low, bears were having a much easier time catching fish down here by the bridge, which may be why we had more bridge closures if anybody had the chance to experience those. Lots of bears catching easy fish down there. And so up at the falls, maybe you weren't seeing as many bears up there because the fishing was so great down below. Other possibilities for that are you did have fluctuations in days where sometimes there were a lot of bears up at the falls. I think one of our rangers said they counted up to 25 at one time. But this can be a little interesting when we talk about the number of fish jumping. So if you're thinking you're seeing a lot of fish jumping up at the falls, why aren't there all these bears around? It can be a little counterintuitive, but sometimes when there's a lot of fish there, the bears can catch their fill very quickly, and then they don't have to linger around as much because they're already full, they're satiated, and then they'll go off into the woods to nap. Whereas when fish jumps are low, bears have to linger around a little bit longer. It's a little bit harder for them to catch the fish, and so they may be around longer for you to actually get to see them there. But it's a great question. We do see population fluctuating. The park here, having the ability to watch the bears on the cams, really opens up this door for all of us to be a part of watching what's unfolding in front of us. And then one last note too, sometimes bears' behaviors will change. So like we were saying, one bear, 1 year you may see up at the falls. So if you take 409, for example, she tends to fish on the lip when she doesn't have any cubs. But this year she's got cubs, and we don't see her up there as much. So when she has cubs, she's staying a little bit farther away from an area that predominantly you see dominant bears. Sorry, I just saw some movement up there, and speaking of bears, that is not a bear, but we are on the beach, so yeah, that would be perfect timing. As you may notice us sometimes from time to time looking over our shoulders, just making sure that bears aren't coming in, but that can make things very exciting
it's a
if
habit.
that happens. Yeah. So excellent question. Is there anything
Oh yes,
I missed?
there is another question here.
Oh.
This one also about bears.
Okay.
So that was fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you, by the way. Great discussion of ecosystem complexity and just the sheer number of variables out here. It's exciting stuff. Folks, you can help us at home by watching for these details as well.
Yes.
So, question number 4.
Okay.
if a mother's koi gets killed shortly upon emerging from the den, would that bear go into estrus at that time and potentially mate within days of losing her cub?
So again, another interesting question, and the short answer to that is yes. When 402 was separated from her cub 503 back in July 2014, I believe, she was separated from her cub. 856 came along and courted her. They mated, and then the following year she returned with 4 spring cubs. So all of that took place within about 2 weeks, so that's a pretty short time span. But basically females can go back into estrus.
How long do male and female brown bears typically live in the wild?
So typically, we say they can live up to 20 years, but they do oftentimes live much longer than that. As far as I know, the oldest bear known to have lived up to 35 years of age. But there are a lot of potential reasons why they may not make it to 20, or they may make it beyond 20. And reasons for mortality can range from infectious diseases to kind of mortal injuries from fighting. And competing out here. And so there were a couple of examples, I believe back in 2015, where 2 bears, separate incidences, died and collapsed just on the side of the river. So this was in October, and that's a time when the park is generally closed. But after some time, after a couple of days had passed, we had rangers return to take some samples and collect and try to investigate what it was that had potentially brought the cub down. So what they discovered was that there was actually a type of virus that is not totally uncommon in this area that had killed the cub. And at the time that they collected the cub for the sampling, viewers, you guys, also noticed that there was a brown lump across the river that later ended up being another bear that had passed away. And so there was a concern that there was some kind of an infectious disease potentially going around. That could have been one possibility, or maybe human caused. And so they again collected samples on that bear and didn't find necessarily that there was a virus involved with that one. But different reasons. You've got cubs, you've got adult bears who potentially aren't going to make it to 20 or make it past 20. But speaking of cubs, infanticide is something that's really common out here. And so only about 1/3 of cubs will survive after their first year. So 2 out of 3 cubs generally don't make it. However, this year is unusual again for another reason, and that is that according to some of our senior rangers out here, all 2,500 calories per fish, so it doesn't take a whole lot for a bear to start racking up all of those calories. Now, you got to think about this too. The bears are trying to eat a year's worth of food in just 6 or less months. So yeah, they've got to eat a lot of fish. They've got to gain lots of calories without burning a whole lot of calories in the process. So generally speaking, we're going to jump right into our fishing strategies.
Oh, I'm ready for this.
Yeah? Okay.
We've got some fishing strategies for you folks. This is the full lineup. Which ones work the best and which ones are the most challenging? You will find out in just a moment, possibly this moment right here.
Shall we jump into this?
Let us jump in. Let us dive in, if you will.
Ooh, yes.
To the stand and wait.
To the stand and wait. All right. So, have you seen this fishing strategy
I have
before?
seen that exact fishing strategy, possibly that exact bear.
Fabulous. So, with the stand and wait, bears tend to stand at the top of Brooks Falls. Yes, very stoically, waiting for sockeye salmon to jump close enough so that they can catch the fish in their mouths. This fishing technique is generally used by adult bears, and they can defend this fishing spot pretty well, but it's also used sometimes for bears. It's a good technique to use when the salmon are jumping at the falls, but once those salmon start slowing down, this is one of the first spots to get abandoned by the bears.
Not the only one.
All right, we have the pirating. The pirate bears.
Yarg.
Yarg. All right, so pirating may be just what it sounds like to some of you, but it's bears stealing fish from other bears. It's more common early in the salmon run, but sometimes we'll see this in September and October. The threat of piracies will actually cause some bears, like subadults, to quickly catch their fish out of the river and run into the woods where it's not as easy for bears to steal their fish. But we will sometimes see the pirating technique out here. Yarg. Alright. Next, we've got diving. Are we going to dive into this one?
Let us dive into diving.
Alrighty. Alright, so this technique doesn't get used that frequently by the bears, but we do sometimes see this at the Brooks River mouth or at the jacuzzi. You might see bears completely submerge underwater here, and in the 80s and 90s there was a bear nicknamed Diver who was a master at this technique, but more recently we've seen 402 and 489 using this diving fishing strategy. So, another good one here. Next, we have the begging, which I think I've done this a couple of times.
We do this a lot around camp.
So, when resources are when bears, again, don't generally tend to share their food with other bears, but some bears will still attempt to beg, reminiscent of a cub, kind of crying a little bit or bawling. We don't see this as much as some of the other strategies, but sometimes we will see the begging technique or behavior out here.
It is somewhat distressing to see.
It is.
You're not trying to respond to this very large bear attempting to be a cub for food.
Next, we've got the snorkel and dive. They're basically just looking for fish underwater. It's a technique that's used universally by most of the bears out here, common both in the summer and the fall, especially in the fall when there's a lot of dead salmon floating underneath the river, and they're looking for those easy calories before they head off to hibernation. So again, another technique there was snorkeling. Got two more here. We've got the sit and wait, and this is one that a lot of people enjoy watching, but the bears enjoy this one as well because it requires very little energy expenditure. Bears will sit at the bottom of the falls in either the plunge pool or the jacuzzi, and they are waiting for fish to bump into them, and once they feel that fish hit their legs or paws, they'll quickly pin it to the bottom of the river, grab it, bite it, and then start eating there. This is another spot that you generally see more of the dominant bears fishing from, but it's a great one down by Brooks Falls too. The sit and wait.
I approve of this strategy. It's a great one.
It is. In the river, it's easier to just do this. Dash, jump on the fish, pin it to the bottom of the river, and grab that guy up. We'll generally see bears abandon this strategy when the salmon run starts slowing down. But those are some of our popular fishing strategies and techniques. So some of the bears, yeah, they might look like they're what you might want to call lazy, but I think it's pretty brilliant what they're doing.
Find a way to make it work.
Calories. Yeah, surviving. It's survival of the fattest. These bears are trying to get as fat as they possibly can, and putting a little plug in there for later on, we are going to have the fattest bear contest coming up. So let's see.
Will it be Otis? Will it be Chunk? Will it be a surprise bear we weren't expecting at all?
Ooh, the under bear.
I'm rooting for one of the subadults. They can do it.
Okay.
They can catch up. I believe in them.
Yeah.
This is good for them to start aspiring when they're young, for later years when they can take the lead. So go subadults. You can do this.
Go subbies.
Sort of.
Okay.
Yeah. Folks, if you are interested in further topics, stay tuned this afternoon. In just a few hours, we're going to have another talk on coastal resources. And keep tuning in the weeks ahead for future Ask a Ranger sessions. Thank you for joining us, folks, and have an excellent afternoon or evening or whatever time of day you are watching right now.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, see ya. And now we pose and look off. There is a float plane. That is perfect timing.
It is.
I feel as though I shouldn't be
look.
saying anything right now. We should just be letting it fly.
Look.
And
Are we
over
gonna
there.
Yes.